In the history of music, there are instruments that prove to eventually be dead ends. There's a few categories of these. One are instruments that in the long run serve no musical purpose. They are dreamt up as novelties or just they don't catch on. The other category of these are instruments that are ultimately superseded when technology gets to the point where it's better than it is in a particular time. And in this video, we're going to be looking at one of those instruments. And you can see I'm holding on to it. And we're going to be talking today about the unusual instrument that is the Ophicleide. The Ophicleide is a brass instrument developed in the early 1800s and did not survive much past the middle of the 1800s, though there are some instances of its use a few decades into the 20th century. In this video, we're going to be covering the history, usage, and compositional aspects of the Ophicleide. The first area we're going to look at is the development and how this unusual instrument came to be. In order to understand the history of the Ophicleide, we need to back up a few years. Our story is going to start in Germany. Here we have an instrument called the flugelhorn. And no, this is not the flugelhorn that we know today, though it is also the ancestor of the modern flugelhorn. The old German flugelhorn is a bugle-like instrument with a conical bore. It was played in hunting parties, out in the wings of the hunting party known as the Flügels in German. This instrument would eventually be coiled up like a modern bugle. In the late 1700s, there was a large influx into England of all things German, particularly figures like the King of England, who brought with him a lot of German musicians. Some of the players brought over the old flugelhorn into England. This instrument, at some point, had keys added onto it. Originally, it may have just been one or two keys that allowed the player to play more chromatically than just the standard harmonic series. But eventually, this gave rise to the instrument called the keyed bugle. This was one of the first chromatic instruments in the brass family, apart from something like the cornetto. But we also need to back up a little bit. Talking about the cornetto in a whole family of brass instruments that aren't made of brass at all, but they're made of wood. The cornetto, also called a cornet, and a serpent. These instruments were popular in Italy and France. The serpent in particular was a bass instrument used a lot in church music. It helped to accompany weak bass lines in the choir. Again, these instruments go to England. At some point around 1800, the serpent gets reformed from its traditional S shape to a more bassoon-like shape. This gets called the English bass horn, not to be confused with the bass English horn. However, let's back up and go back to our keyed bugle. The keyed bugle eventually makes its way to France. The French have a penchant for creating instruments in a large family. This is seen throughout the 1800s. And the keyed bugle was no exception to this. At some point, someone decided to make larger sizes of the keyed bugle. An alto version that was called a quintoclave, and then the bass version called the Ophicleide. The Ophicleide probably takes its shape from the English bass horn that originally came from the serpent. So we have two separate lineages coming together. The lineage from the flugelhorn to the keyed bugle, and then the lineage from the serpent to the English bass horn. They merge together and they give us our modern Ophicleide. But we're not going to stop our story there, because the Ophicleide is now a French instrument. It gets taken to Germany. By about 1830, the valves have taken off, and the makers Moritz and Wieprecht have taken an instrument and put valves on it to replace the Ophicleide in Germany. This instrument Wieprecht calls the bass tuba. And it's from this that our modern tubas are descended. Well, that bass tuba gets taken back to France, and another maker named Adolphe Sax gets a hold of it and tries to develop it even further, makes it larger, and we get our family of sax horns. So we can see how the flugelhorn leads to the keyed bugle, which leads directly to the Ophicleide, which leads to the bass tuba, which leads back to the sax horn, which leads to our modern family of tubas, euphoniums, and flugelhorns. So as you can see, the Ophicleide has a very unusual evolutionary history. It's what we would call, in terms of evolution, a hybrid instrument, descending from two distinct lineages that come together to form one instrument. Oddly enough, this instrument itself splits off into two lineages, which we'll talk about at a later point. But let's talk about the instrument in general. And I'll use my Ophicleide here as an example. This is a B-flat bass Ophicleide. That means that the lowest note it will play without pressing any of the keys down is a B-flat. Let's see if I can play that. As you can see, I'm not a fantastic player. I have only had this instrument about 4 or 5 days, and I'm still getting used to it. But we'll use it as a demonstration. So, unlike woodwind instruments where the keys close holes, on the Ophicleide the keys open holes, except for the first key, and that's this one here. For the first finger of the left hand, it closes one tone hole. This is the only open standing tone hole. That means that if I press this down, it lowers the pitch half a step down to A. So if open standing in B flat, close that, we're now in A. And the other keys, this instrument has 11 keys, will open the other tone holes. And by using various keys and combinations of keys, I can get all 12 notes of the chromatic scale. What's interesting and what sets the Ophicleide apart from the other brass instruments is that it absolutely requires the use of its fundamental range. On other instruments, we call these pedal notes, but this is a standard and essential part of Ophicleide's technique. And when we get into the compositional elements of this, you'll see that there is a serious drawback to the fact that the Ophicleide requires the use of its pedal notes. When looking at composers and literature for the Ophicleide, there are 4 primary composers that we need to look at: Hector Berlioz, Felix Mendelssohn, Richard Wagner, and Giuseppe Verdi. We'll first start out, of course, with Hector Berlioz. You've heard throughout this video excerpts from Berlioz's Symphonie Fantastique, which is the first major orchestral work to introduce the Ophicleide to the orchestra. In this work, the Ophicleide intones the Dies Irae, along with 4 bassoons. In fact, it's not just one Ophicleide, but a pair of Ophicleides. And in fact, Berlioz's original scoring was for 4 bassoons, 1 Ophicleide, and 1 serpent, but the serpent was quickly discarded after it proved not able to handle the difficulties of Berlioz's part. Thereafter, 2 Ophicleides were used. At some point, Berlioz said it was okay to use tubas on the part, but this belies his original intention. The ghastly sounds of the Ophicleide invoke the sounds of the underworld and hell itself. Berlioz would continue to use the Ophicleide to the end of his career, including it in every major orchestral work he wrote. Berlioz, in his latter years, would also use a tuba alongside the Ophicleide, always as a pair, the Ophicleide being placed on top with the tuba being placed on the bottom. Our next composer is Felix Mendelssohn. Mendelssohn started out writing for the English bass horn in some of his early works, notably the Overture in C for Winds and the Trauer March for Winds, as well as the Overture to A Midsummer Night's Dream. However, by the time he got to completing the rest of the music for A Midsummer Night's Dream, he would change his mind about using the bass horn and instead would use the Ophicleide. He would again use the Ophicleide in his great cantata Elijah. The use of the Ophicleide in Germany was somewhat more limited than its use in France. Richard Wagner would use the Ophicleide occasionally in some of his early works, like The Flying Dutchman. However, he quickly abandoned this and decided that the new bass tuba of Wieprecht and Moritz was a much better solution to the ideas that he had. Down south in Italy, Giuseppe Verdi would also use the Ophicleide, sometimes under the name cimbasso, which was an Italian term for corno in basso, or bass horn. Verdi would use the Ophicleide as late as his Requiem in the 1870s. Verdi is known to have despised the tuba and never scored for it except for some rare on-stage band parts within his operas. But within the orchestra itself, he never used a tuba. This is very surprising for a work as late as the 1870s. The Ophicleide had been passé for several decades by this point. Perhaps one of the strangest occurrences in the Ophicleide's history is its use in Brazil. For some reason, the Ophicleide managed to last until the 1920s in some parts of Brazil, where it was used for the traditional choros. The Ophicleide slowly died out in Western classical music. And there's several compounding factors in this. One, the instrument was poorly designed. The key work, the fingering system, is illogical at best. At worst, it's cumbersome, awkward, and stupid. Were a more modern fingering system applied to the Ophicleide, it would be a much more usable instrument. The tone quality of the Ophicleide in the hands of a bad player is not acceptable. However, in the hands of an exceptional player, it can be beautiful, lyrical, and comical at times. Composers wanted an instrument that would be able to play down into the bass registers of the brass section. The Ophicleide did not meet that criteria. Its lowest register, yes, will go down to, in this case on this instrument, an A below the bass clef, but as you go lower and lower into the range, the tone of the instrument begins to get weaker and poorer. However, the higher range of this instrument can be quite beautiful. Composers forgot this aspect and they wanted to use this primarily in the bottom. Therefore, composers were not using the Ophicleide to its maximum potential. At some point in the later part of the 1800s, competitions were held on the Ophicleide to find the best soloists out there, particularly with brass bands where this instrument was still used. The winners of these competitions would receive a brand new euphonium and were expected to switch over to the new instrument. And that actually leads us into our discussion on what instrument is the most appropriate modern substitute for the Ophicleide, because we don't expect our orchestral players to be able to play this ancient instrument. By and large, the part will fall, of course, to the tuba player in the orchestra. And the tuba player has options on what instrument they will use. A lot of times the player will bring a small F tuba to cover the Ophicleide part. However, the F tuba is a considerably larger instrument than even this large B-flat Ophicleide. Probably a more appropriate instrument would be the euphonium, as evidenced by those early competitions where the winner got a euphonium. They're the same pitch range. They use actually very similar mouthpiece. In fact, this mouthpiece that I use on this Ophicleide is smaller than a euphonium mouthpiece. So take, for instance, a piece like Symphonie Fantastique. A lot of times we'll expect to see two big tubas back there, but in reality we probably should be seeing two euphoniums back there performing this Dies Irae as well as some of the other parts. In fact, if you look at the part to Symphonie Fantastique, you'll notice it is quite high. In the original, it goes all the way up to a B flat above the bass clef, which would be decent enough high range on this instrument. On an F tuba, that would be extremely high. More and more conductors and performers are looking to the euphonium as a more appropriate substitute for the Ophicleide. However, as you can see, actual Ophicleides are becoming more and more used. Players are once again taking up the instrument because they realize that the sound of the Ophicleide cannot be fully replicated on the modern tuba or euphonium. To that effect, this is a modern instrument. It's essentially brand new. After nearly 100 years or more of them not being produced, they are once again being made. This particular instrument is out of a Chinese factory. This is a stencil horn, as we call it. A stencil horn being a company puts their brand on it and markets it as their own. These instruments are starting to grow somewhat in popularity. They're somewhat affordable. And tuba players looking to add another weapon to their arsenal to be more and more versatile are looking at the Ophicleide as a potential weapon to add to their lineup. So we're starting to see tuba players playing this more and more, and euphonium players as well. In fact, it looks like more and more euphonium players are looking at the Ophicleide than are tuba players, which makes sense because this instrument is in the same range as the euphonium. With this resurgence, it is possible that composers like myself could start using the Ophicleide once again in their compositions. However, by and large, that's something that is only going to be available for specialty reasons. I would not score for this instrument in a work I would expect to be played by a general ensemble. If I were scoring a work for my own Zephyrus wind ensemble, I might, assuming I can find a player who would be willing to take up the task of performing on the Ophicleide. So it is possible that we are in a modern renaissance for the Ophicleide, but it's still being treated as a historical instrument. There is one final aspect of the Ophicleide that we do need to touch on. And I mentioned this earlier in the video, that the Ophicleide branches off into two separate families. One of which is, of course, the modern tubas and euphonium and flugelhorns, if we include those as well. The other is a little bit more contentious, and that is that the Ophicleide is theorized to have been the ancestor of the saxophone. And the theory goes, or rather the hypothesis goes, that Adolf Sax, while experimenting in his workshop, took an Ophicleide and put on a bass clarinet mouthpiece or something similar onto it, and was able to produce essentially a proto-saxophone. If we look at Sax's original patent, and that image is actually shown earlier in the video if you remember, the original bass saxophone that Sax designed was almost identical to an Ophicleide. So what we're going to do is we're going to recreate that potential experiment. I have my Ophicleide here. We're going to take off the mouthpiece, and I have a bass clarinet mouthpiece right here, and this does not fit. So bass clarinet mouthpiece of Sax's day was probably a lot smaller. So let's try a different mouthpiece. I have an alto clarinet mouthpiece. This is quite a bit narrower Let's see if it fits on. It just barely does. So let's see what happens. I'm just going to play the open B flat. And it works, and it does sound kind of like a bass saxophone. If you saw another video I did, I took a baritone saxophone mouthpiece, which fits perfectly on here. And it works quite well. So there is that hypothesis out there that the saxophone itself is descended from the Ophicleide, which means that both the tuba and the saxophone are descended from the same instrument. Now, historians don't put a lot of credence into this hypothesis, mostly because we have absolutely no evidence that Sax did this. He left no records on how he came up with the saxophone. It is also equally likely that Sax wanted to develop a single reed instrument that could easily overblow the octave. And the only way to do that is with a conical bore instrument. And to create a conical bore instrument as large as Sax wanted, he would had to have done it out of metal, because a wooden instrument this size would have been simply too heavy and too difficult to manufacture. The Ophicleide shape would have been a natural shape to put it in, being copied itself off of the shape of a bassoon. So we don't fully know. So I hope you find this interesting about the Ophicleide. And if you do like this kind of style video, let me know, and I'd be interested in making others on the history of some other instruments. So until next time, let's keep our eyes out for the Ophicleide.